Singapore has been touted as the place to live, work and play. Today's Point Blank explores what tourists and expats really think of Singapore and whether locals have been doing their part as tourist ambassadors. After all, the tourism industry here is closely watched as an important economic contributor, with hotels, restaurants and retail revenue as key indicators of the economy. Last year, total hotel room revenue grew by 12% to hit a record high of $2.1 billion. There were about 10 million visitor arrivals, with tourism receipts estimated at a record high of $14.8 billion in 2008. Tourism campaigns have labelled Singapore as the destination to visit. STB's Uniquely Singapore brand was launched as early as 2004. Stars have already been flying high the Singapore flag abroad. Tanya Chua, for example, is one of the more prolific unofficial tourism ambassadors of Singapore. She has performed at STB festivals in countries ranging from Malaysia to Japan and also hosts many Taiwanese friends who visited Singapore. Another celeb would be Atu, who served as Singapore's tourism ambassador for Greater China in 2004 and 2005. He read up and memorized good tourism spots to recommend to his Chinese fans there. Being a heartlander, he said he usually takes his overseas friends to cheap and good places like hawker centres. Label mate JJ Lin took over the role of tourism ambassador for Greater China from Atu in 2006. Gurmit Singh flexed his star power with his screen persona Phua Chu Kang, who was appointed STB's celebrity ambassador for Malaysia in 2004. Apparently, his infectious humour appealed to Malaysians and his image reflected Singapore's fun, spontaneous and energetic side. Speaking of celeb ambassadors, who can forget the late Ah Ming, a female Sumatran orang-utan? Apart from being such an icon of Singapore's tourism industry, was conferred Special Tourism Ambassador by STB in 1992. But the role of Tourism Ambassador isn't only a job for the stars. On the home front, the STB has been rolling out programs to educate and engage local residents to be tourism ambassadors of the Uniquely Singapore brand. For example, STB has recruited volunteers, not all of them local, to become Uniquely Singapore friends since June last year. And their job? Well, to help tourists with information, directions and advice at Singapore visitor centres around the island. Yet, how does raising the visibility of Singapore as a great place to live, work and play match up with the not-so-attractive traits Singaporeans are known for? Reality bites when you mention Kiasu-ism, for example. The term, which means afraid to lose out, has been used countless times to represent the iconic Singaporean who jumps queues, elbows others to get to products on sale, and refuses to give way when driving. And who can ignore the tissue chopping phenomenon, which has been the subject of much public discussion? Some foreigners, and even locals themselves, are baffled by the widely accepted use of tissue paper packers to reserve seats at food courts. Is all this uniquely Singapore too, which are endearing, unusual in qualities, or just downright ugly? Let's find out what both expats and Singaporeans think on today's Point Blank. Hi, I'm E-von.
And I'm Poh Kwan. You are watching Point Blank.
That's right. Today we find out from these people from overseas in our studio whether the average Singaporean makes a good tourism ambassador. First up, we have Haruka Hikita, who was from Japan and is now a permanent resident for just about a year. She's lived in Singapore since she was 7 for about 10 years now. And we have also Sean Tuig from Britain, who's been in Singapore for just barely a year. For starters, we'll just, start with, why you're in Singapore, why you chose to live in Singapore in the first place, and how you got to Singapore. Maybe start with Haruka.
Okay.
Ladies first.
Yeah, ladies first.
Right. Well, I came to Singapore when I was 7 because of my dad's job. Mm-hmm. Well, we were told to stay in Singapore maybe for 3 years. Because, normally it's a turnover is 3 years for a businessman, but my dad decided to stay on longer. And now they live in Singapore for almost 20 years, and myself 10 years or 11 years already. So, well, it was not really my choice to... Yeah, exactly. But then I studied overseas in Australia. Then I decided to start working in Singapore because working environment in Singapore is, especially for women, is more like better situation than in Japan. And also my family is still here in Singapore. Yeah, and well, even though I'm Japanese and I'm not Singaporean, but I still felt that here is somehow it's like local for me, Singapore is.
Was there any reason why your parents decided to stay on past the 3-year mark?
Well, the reason why my dad came to Singapore was because when he, it was like 40 years ago, he came to Singapore for his business trip. Then he thought, wow, that's such a warm country. I love it.
So that was his first impression.
Yes, of my dad, right? Okay. And then since then, he always wanted to work in Singapore. Then along the way, he just, tried to seek an opportunity to work in Singapore. And then here we go, he made it here. So it was his intention to stay longer from the beginning, but without us knowing.
Hey! Oh, forgot. Yeah, I have a daughter.
What about Sean?
Yeah, I've been here about a year. I used to live and work in London for about 18 years. Came here last year, mostly to be closer to family. My brother's lived in Singapore for about 6 years, and he got married here. So I came here first of all to see him and his new wife, and liked the place. So decided to come here mostly for family reasons, and ended up getting a job here. So I've kind of settled down here, and I'm enjoying my stay in Singapore very much.
So Sean, before actually deciding to stay in Singapore, did you come to Singapore for like a short holiday or something? What were your impressions?
I originally came to Singapore for a couple of weeks just to meet my brother and his wife, and they showed me around, and I thought the place was really nice. It had come after a kind of depressing year for me because I'd had a bad accident at work. So it was a kind of holiday and a chance to see family and a bit of a morale boost, really. But I like the city. The weather, which a lot of people complain about, I find it a little bit oppressive, but it was kind of kinder to me than the weather in Britain is. And at that point, it kind of represented a kind of zone of opportunity for me, something kind of different and new to explore, as opposed to the same kind of things that I'd been doing in London for such a long time.
So you're saying you kind of like the place, but how about Singaporeans? You don't have to feel bad. I'm the only Singaporean in this entire living room. She's Malaysian. I'm the only Singaporean here.
I don't have that many complaints, frankly. I find the driving quite terrifying.
Oh, the driving?
Yeah, it is
Have
quite.
you been to China?
Have you been to Bangkok?
But I mean,
KL.
Apart from that, I can't say I've had any really bad kind of experiences, kind of interpersonal experiences, But I would guess that's partially because of the language barrier, I don't understand what, if I'm sitting in a hawker centre and I'm eating my tea and minding my own business, conversations are going on around me and people could be talking about all kinds of things, including myself, but I would have absolutely no idea.
So even if they were to speak in English, you may not be able to understand? No.
I'm talking about, when people are talking in Mandarin or the dialect. Yeah. I've simply got no knowledge about, I mean, obviously, when I go and order food, people speak to me in English, and it's kind of my kind of responsibility to make myself understood and to understand them. But, if I'm on the bus or the MRT or walking down the street, most of what is going on around me in terms of people's conversation or people who may be arguing with each other, for example, it passes me by.
So do you feel like you're, even if you're in a crowd like full of Singaporeans, you feel that you're alone in the place?
Well, I mean, I lived in London for a long time, and like all large cities, it's quite alienating, and you kind of build up a certain kind of carapace around yourself. You go out, you do what you need to do, and you go home. Everybody has their own particular kind of social sphere inside this vast kind of metropolis. You have the friends that you meet regularly, the places that you tend to go, and everything else is kind of like not like background noise, but it kind of passes you by and you interact with it when you see fit. So it's not really kind of like the lonely man in the crowd. I'm just quite used to kind of traversing my way through large cities.
So you're saying that Singapore is just like any other cosmopolitan city, just large and
I guess so,
people are sort of estranged from each other.
Yeah.
It's a necessary ill.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of that level, I would argue that Singapore is certainly a more social city than London is, for example. London is extremely alienating. And unlike parts of London, Singapore is, or at least from my perception of it, it's a city in the way that people understand what cities are, in which they are large conurbations where people live, where other Western cities, London being an example, it's a city, but it's not really the same thing. There's a large core of London where people don't really live. They commute from the suburbs, they work, they do their thing, and they go home. So after business hours in central London, and a quite large part of central London, there's not a huge amount of social activity apart from commercial activity. Whereas here, people live in the city, they go about their business, within the heart of the city, which is a little bit different to London.
Yeah, talking about cities, Haruka, you lived in Tokyo as well. Do you think that Singapore is comparable with Tokyo in terms of, being welcoming to foreigners and such?
Well, I don't know if I can talk about Tokyo, but in terms of like welcoming city like Singapore, well, I would say Singapore is more tolerant to foreigners. That's what I think.
They don't say so.
Well, they don't care about who you are, and if you may be different, but the difference is so natural to you, right, to Singaporeans. So
it's an immigrant city to begin with.
Yeah, exactly. So
not so homogenous like Japan.
But in Tokyo, maybe recently it's been changing a lot because we see a lot of more foreigners. But back in while I was still in Japan, Japan was still very closed, and there was not many foreigners. And if you do not dress properly outside, like Tokyo people, then you'll be like,
single out.
Yeah.
So you are the strange alien from another planet.
Exactly. So when I'm in Japan, I try to, put makeup and try to dress like them, and so I try to be like them. But in Singapore, you can be yourself.
Oh, that's cool.
Well, that's interesting.
Sean, and Haruka, I'm sure since they have chosen to live here, that's because they have pretty good first impressions of Singapore. So, but for tourists, we don't know yet. So we'll find out more in the next segment.
When we come back.